I hear them gates swing open wide. Written by Dollars Tor and read for you by Eleanor Elizabeth. Summary. Shouta thought Reapers were only fictional. He never expected to actually meet one, or for him to look so young. He remembered the rubble, the familiar smile being replaced by concrete and blood whenever he let himself linger on the memory for too long, whenever he was tired enough to dream. It got better as time moved on, the images becoming less vivid, the dreams only popping up after a particularly bad day or when the anniversary was approaching. He remembered their little group graduating with one less member than they started out with. But there was another detail that he remembered about the incident. He remembered a flash of green. The first time Shouta actually met him was roughly 1 year into his career as a hero. He'd been working his way through the usual patrol route when he glimpsed something in a nearby alleyway. It was only natural that he moved to check it out. The bodies lying among the trash weren't an unusual sight, as unfortunate as it was. This was a fairly common occurrence in areas like this. But the kid, something felt off, and considering his track record, he knew better than to just ignore it. "Hey kid," he called out, readying his capture weapon in case they made a run for it. The kid turned, and the first thing Eraserhead noticed was how green his hair was. The second thing he noticed was that he couldn't actually see his eyes. Well, he couldn't really see that much of his face at all. "What are you doing out here?" The boy tilted his head, but made no attempt to answer. The hero looked away for a few seconds to report the bodies. When he looked up, the boy was gone. The second time he met him, the boy came to him. He'd been sitting on the edge of a roof at the end of his shift when he felt like he was being watched. His gaze slid over to the shadows. It didn't take long for the boy to show himself. "I figured you'd want an explanation," he offered as a greeting. Shouta would be lying if he said he didn't want answers, but considering what he saw that night, or more specifically, what he didn't see, and how easily the boy had found him, he'd say his wariness was justified. "Give me one good reason why I shouldn't just call the police." The report had concluded that the boy had nothing to do with what happened, but his presence had been suspiciously absent from all the documents he'd been able to comb through. Something about this kid had him on edge. "You can't arrest someone who doesn't technically exist," the boy pointed out as he stepped closer. He seemed awfully pale in the moonlight. "I'm also not exactly human." It was only then that Shouta caught his eyes, or at least where his eyes should be. Instead, all that was there was darkness. He activated his quirk. Nothing happened. "What are you?" The boy merely grinned. It was probably meant to be reassuring, but the lack of eyes only made it look menacing, something that wasn't all helped by the shadows billowing around him. "Call me Izuku," he replied. "And to answer your question, I'm a Reaper." Shouta could feel the headache forming already. Izuku, as it turned out, was decent company. Shouta generally wasn't one for idle conversation, and other than a few times he started a conversation, Izuku seemed happy enough with the silence. They didn't always have the chance to meet up. Their respective work kept them both pretty busy, though a kid having a job revolving around death was something that had initially taken some getting used to. "I'm far older than you'll ever be," had been the Reaper's response when he'd voiced the observation after encountering him after he finished doing whatever it was that he did with the bodies. He hadn't sounded offended. Amused would be more accurate, but Shouta had made a note to avoid the age thing in the future. Sometimes, if the night was a particularly slow one, Izuku would share stories from times Shouta had only glimpsed at in history books. Most of them were about ordinary people, names that had been forgotten by time. If Shouta was being honest, those stories were his favourite, an opinion which he knew the Reaper understood, if not shared. "What happens to them?" he'd asked one night when the curiosity finally got to him. "The souls," he clarified when the Reaper merely quirked a brow. "I don't know," Izuku admitted from his perch on the rooftop railing. The answer was a surprising one. "You don't know?" He watched as Izuku dropped down to stand next to him, his feet landing soundlessly against the concrete. His expression was a solemn one. It was strange seeing it on someone who looked so young, despite the fact that his actual age was somewhere in the thousands. "No," he shook his head. "A Reaper's duty is only to guide them to the other side. Afterlife new life, whatever happens then is beyond our reach. He pulled his hood up. The soul moves on. The Reaper remains. And with that, he disappeared. Shouta made a mental note not to bring it up again. His newest batch of hero students were promising. A bit rough around the edges maybe, but you'd have a hard time finding a first-year hero course student who wasn't. He hadn't even expelled anyone this year, though one of them was on thin ice. You sound like a parent. Izuku had smiled when he told him about them. Shouta had decided that arguing would be pointless. He knew the Reaper wouldn't be convinced otherwise. They wouldn't be meeting up again for a while. Shota's patrol hours would be shorter now they had class to teach, and, as unfortunate as it was, he knew the Reaper would be busy as well. As he watched the boy fade into the shadows, he couldn't quite shake the thought that, under different circumstances, it would have been nice to have Izuku in his class. The USJ happened. Admittedly, it had scared him when he woke up in that hospital bed to see Izuku standing over him. He hadn't been afraid of the thought of his own death for a long time, but the idea of dying now that the beginnings of what could potentially be the biggest threat in a decade had surfaced was one that terrified him. Relax, it's not your time yet, the Reaper reassured him. Shouta watched through the slits in his bandages as he settled into the chair. His presence was far more comforting than it probably should have been. It can't be your time yet. Oh, Shouta thought as his exhaustion caught up to him. Izuku didn't want him to die yet either. They didn't get the chance to meet up again until the aftermath of the Camino incident and All Might's retirement. The night was a heavy one. There is something on the horizon, Izuku commented as they stared at the wreckage left over from the fight. I don't know what, but the shadows are restless. Well, Shouta thought grimly to himself, that was reassuring. Do you have any ideas at least? He knew Izuku's predictions tended to be fairly accurate, so if the Reaper said to expect the worst, he would. And, if he were being honest, he was already expecting the worst. The Reaper said nothing for a long moment. When he did turn to face him, Shouta felt the breath freeze in his lungs. There was a heaviness in the usually vacant gaze, one that wouldn't be possible for a normal person to exhibit. The word he whispered was barely audible, yet it seemed to echo in the shadows surrounding them. War. Izuku's prediction, as it turned out, was correct. Eventually, they won, though won is hardly the term he'd use to describe it, but the losses on both sides were pretty heavy. He didn't even want to think about how Izuku was handling the whole thing. Sure, dealing with the dead was kind of his job, but he'd seen just how heavy the duty was on his small frame. You humans and your conflict, the Reaper sighed warily as he crouched low on the railing. The appearance of Quirk certainly hasn't made that any easier to deal with. He sometimes forgot his friend knew what it was like before they existed. A part of him wanted to ask about it, but he knew now wasn't the time. I'm sorry. It's not your fault. Did you know about Oboro? He asked, once things had mostly calmed down. He hadn't been sure whether or not to bring it up, but in the end his curiosity was too high to ignore. Izuku didn't seem surprised by the question, but he didn't look like he'd been expecting it. No, he furrowed his brow at the answer. I'm sure I saw you that day. It wasn't that Shouta thought he was lying. The Reaper had proven to be fairly honest, but he couldn't help but feel like something was off. Death called for him that day, Izuku began, scuffing an old boot against the concrete. I showed up too early. I had to lay low until there was enough shadows for me to work with. By the time it was dark enough for me to do anything, he was gone. He shrugged. I figured another Reaper had done the job before I could, and then someone had shown up to take away the body. I didn't know about the whole, what do you call it, Nomu? I didn't know about it until you told me. I didn't know you operated so close to each other, he commented. We don't, usually, Izuku hummed. We go where the death is. You didn't think I just stayed in Japan all the time, did you? He supposed that would be an illogical assumption. Are all Reapers as social as you? He's not sure why he asked, but Izuku didn't seem to mind. Not really, he shook his head. When your whole existence revolves around death, it can make dealing with the living difficult. Friendships don't necessarily go against the code, but it makes things difficult when time comes to send them off. He wasn't looking at him, but Shouta caught the unspoken message easily enough. The thing about time was that it always flew by too fast. Shouta had watched as his students, who had been through far too much compared to any hero corps student before them, graduated and slowly began ascending through the ranks. He watched as heroes he'd worked with for years retired one by one, their roles being handed off to fresh faces. He'd known his own retirement was fast approaching. He was slowing down in combat, taking longer breaks. It didn't surprise him when he wound up in the hospital after an assignment went wrong. Hisashi had retired from heroics weeks ago, so he visited often. Hitoshi and Eri also showed up frequently, despite their busy schedules. Sometimes it amazed him how he was able to have a family who cared about each other this much. He wouldn't trade them for the world, he thought to himself, as he waved them off at the end of the day. It was dark when he woke up. He wasn't sure what had disturbed his sleep at first, at least not until his gaze locked with the figure standing sentry in the corner of the room. The solemn air hanging around him was enough for Shouta to figure out the reason for this particular meeting. "Izuku?" He nodded in greeting, slowly pushing himself up to lean back against the headboard. "I had a feeling I'd be seeing you sooner or later." The Reaper pushed off the wall before walking to hover awkwardly at his bedside. "I put it off for as long as I could," he informed him. "I can't give you any more time, I'm sorry." It wasn't his fault. Shouta knew it would happen eventually. At least he knew he was in good hands. "Thank you for waiting." His last memory had been a happy one. He guessed that had been the intention. "Are you ready?" "As ready as I'll ever be." It wasn't as though he had many regrets, and, as his friend had just said, they didn't have any more time. "Just try and relax, okay?" The boy smiled. "It makes things a lot easier." Shouta wasn't exactly sure what he meant, but he trusted him. Izuku's eyes flashed green. Shota's world turned black. His heart fell silent.